Hello, Foresters. Thank you so much for those of you joining us virtually for our Elections, Not Politics with Dr. Ruthi presentation. A few years ago, we started inviting our Professor of the Year to share a presentation with us during homecoming weekend. So Dwight Roddigam 2 years ago, Dr. Becky Benjamin last year, and this year we are with our 2020 Professor of the Year, Dr. Mary Ruthi. So I hope that you enjoy what she has to share with us today. We encourage you to engage with us on YouTube by asking questions if you have any questions for her at the end of her presentation. And we also encourage you to join us for Davis Hall Follies at 7:30, also a virtual event, which I believe will be streamed maybe YouTube and Facebook. Confirmed? Yes, perfect. Okay, awesome. Okay. Dr. Ruthi.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the Alumni Office. I'll take this off so people can hear me. I'd like to thank the Alumni Office and the PR folks for making this evening possible and allowing me to talk about something that I find really interesting. I want to go through 3 basic points, because every good sermon needs 3 basic points, right? So first of all, talk a little bit about what's been happening with our election system in the recent years. And secondly, spend a little time talking about the Electoral College, which I think a lot of folks find confusing and difficult. And finally, finish up with maybe some projections about what's likely to happen in the election upcoming in about a month from now. So, first of all, what's been going on in our election system in recent years, and we'll see how this goes. What we see, I think, is a lot of polarization in our electorate. And you can probably see on that chart that white evangelicals lean Republican by a margin of more than 4-1. On the other hand, black women lean Democratic by a margin of 87-7. And if you look down through there, you can see a regional divide. Rural Southerners tend to be Republican. Urban Northeasterners tend to be Democratic. You can see that people who go to church more often tend to be Republican more than people who don't go to church. Women in general are more Democratic than men are. So you can see some polarization, some real divisions between those groups. And also, I guess just to highlight the religion factor, this information is from the Pew Research Institute, which is a pretty reputable group. And they're looking here at the change in religion over the last, a dozen years or so, from 2008 to 2019. And you can see in the middle graph there that Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to identify as Christian. There's been some decline since 2008, showing the increased secularization in our society. But still, among Republicans, or those that lean Republican, about 80% identify as Christian. Among those who are Democrat or lean Democrat, only about half identify as Christian. So really a huge division there. And I think because religion goes so much to the heart of who we are as people, it's a really important value we hold. When you see that much division between the parties, it creates, I think, more of a polarization than like a regional difference, let's say. Okay, let us wander back to where I was before, maybe. And I think also a factor that has contributed to polarization in the electorate is the political parties themselves. In the last election for Congress, in the House of Representatives, only about 20% of the House races ended up with a margin of victory that was less than 10%. In other words, 80% of people elected to the House of Representatives won by a margin of more than 10%. So what that's saying is most of those congressional seats are not really competitive. And what tends to happen is that districts that are overwhelmingly Republican become even more Republican, and the candidates don't have to play to the Democratic Party. They have enough Republicans that they can carry their district without appealing to the moderates or the leftists. And the same thing happens on the Democratic side. So what we've seen in Congress, and if you pay much attention to Congress, maybe the House especially, you've seen that sort of thing, that split between Republicans and Democrats, sort of hating on each other and yelling at each other across the Great Divide. And part of that's because the Democrats are getting more liberal and the Republicans are getting more conservative and the moderates are getting squeezed out. We even see it in the Senate. People from Indiana may remember Richard Lugar, a moderate who got defeated in the primary elections a few years back, or Joe Donnelly, a moderate, got defeated. So that I think what we're seeing is more and more of that polarization, the extremes in Congress. And finally, in terms of the polarization of the electorate, people are tending to get their news mostly from sources that already agree with them. It's kind of an echo chamber. If you're a Republican, maybe you listen to Fox News, or maybe you just listen to Rush Limbaugh, and if you want a diverse point of view, you listen to Sean Hannity, and it just kind of reinforces what you already think. If you're a Democrat, you're on CNN or ABC News, and again, maybe more of a left-leaning perspective, and yeah, that's right. And people often don't listen to news from other points of view. So I think it's hard to see both sides of an issue when all you're hearing is from one side of an issue and it reinforces what you already think. So again, we have Republicans thinking that Democrats are idiots and Democrats thinking that Republicans are idiots, and very few of them sit down and talk with each other to discover, maybe not after all, maybe they're not so bad. Okay, another thing that I think we see happening in our society, presidential elections, some of them very, very close. Only 5 presidential elections in our history have had an electoral college winner who won less than a plurality of the popular vote. And if you're curious, and you probably aren't, but it would be John Quincy Adams back in 1824, Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, that was the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, Benjamin Harrison in 1888, and then George W. Bush in 2000. Gore won the popular vote by 0.5%, and Bush just squeaked through, some of you may remember, by getting Florida's electoral votes, and that put him over the top. And then Donald Trump in 2016, Clinton actually won the popular vote by 2%, and that is by far the widest margin by which a loser has ended up winning the popular vote. So if Hillary Clinton is a little frustrated by that, one can kind of understand why, because she clearly won the popular vote, but not the Electoral College vote. The last time we really had a blowout in terms of one side winning by a large margin was Ronald Reagan in 1984. And he won by 18% in the popular vote, 98% in the Electoral College. Usually the Electoral College vote looks like there's more difference between the two candidates than there actually is, because the winner of the electoral vote usually wins a number of states by a fairly narrow margin, and the loser in those states gets nothing in the Electoral College. So it looks like, boy, Reagan just won by a massive amount. Well, 18%'s a lot, but it's not as much as 98%, which the Electoral College showed. And since 1984, Obama in 2004 had the next highest total. He won by 7% and took about 2/3 of the vote in the Electoral College. So we've had a number of close elections in recent years, and I don't know, there are some problems or issues with that, but that's the trend. Another change or trend that we see in the political system now, we have more options for voting. Early voting, North Carolina leads the pack there. They started early voting on the 4th of September, which is 2 months ahead of the election. And you may think that's a good idea or not, but that's kind of how it is. All states allow early voting. Even Indiana, you can vote early. And along with that, registration's a lot easier than it used to be. In Indiana, you can register online, you can register by mail, you can register at the motor vehicle department, you can register at the county clerk's office, public assistance office, probably a few other places. It's a lot easier than it used to be to register, which means it's easier to vote if you want to vote, because it's easier to be sure that you're registered. And voting by mail, which I will mention later on, is easier than it used to be. In some states, all of the voting is by mail. But most states have made it easier for people to get absentee ballots or to vote by mail, easier than it used to be. I must say, way back when I was in graduate school and voted absentee, I had to get my ballot notarized by a notary public before I could mail it in. I did it. I've always been a politics junkie, but I can understand why people didn't, because it took a lot of time and effort to do that. Okay, second point. I want to talk a little about the Electoral College, and with any luck, I can actually find a map of the Electoral College here. Yes. You can see that some states have much bigger numbers than other states. And some of you may be wondering, where do these numbers come from? It kind of looks like, I don't know, bingo or something with multiple columns. Well, each state's electoral vote total is the sum of the number of senators and the number of representatives that state has. Every state has 2 senators. Okay? And every state has at least 1 representative. So you can see Wyoming sitting out here, 3 electoral votes, 1 representative and 2 senators. On the other hand, you can see California with 55 electoral votes, 2 senators and 53 representatives. And you can kind of see, the heaviest concentration of electoral votes tends to be in the areas where we have a lot of cities, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains. Not too much going on out there because there aren't a lot of people out there. Okay, so that's kind of how those votes are divided up. Let me go back to where I was here. If I could find my cursor, which there's a reason they call it a cursor. Yes. So why do we have an electoral college? Well, it's really a compromise between the founders, the founding fathers, and they were all men, so I guess we could call them founding fathers, who wanted Congress to elect the president, and those who wanted direct voter election. And really what it boiled down to is that most of the founders didn't trust people to choose wisely. They did not want a pure democracy. They wanted protection from the passions of the people who might get carried away and vote for some demagogue or some fool just because he was good looking or whatever. So the Electoral College is put in there as kind of a buffer between people who might make bad decisions, but the electors, it was thought originally that they actually would vote the way they wanted to vote. So people would choose the electors, and the electors would choose the president on behalf of the people. Now that's changed over the years. Now when we vote for president, we don't even think about the fact that we're not voting for the president, but technically we're voting for a slate of electors who have promised to vote for the candidate that we want to be voting for, but we're voting for it indirectly. And if the electors chose not to vote for that candidate, states differ in how much penalty they would apply, but it would be like maybe a fine or kick you out of the party or something. So if electors chose not to vote for the candidate they were supposed to, that could happen. So yeah, that's one of the main reasons we have the Electoral College. People who like the Electoral College, and the founders also, would say it's important for all of the states to have a clear voice in the elections. Without the Electoral College, small states, rural states would be ignored, and that candidates would hang out in the big cities or states with big population, and places like Nebraska and North Dakota and Wyoming, flyover country, nobody would pay any attention to them, and they would have almost no voice in the election because they don't have a very large population. And I think, again, back in the day, your state was a bigger deal than it is today. Back at the time of the founding fathers, being from Massachusetts instead of Virginia was a big deal. It's not as big a deal to us today, but I think, again, that's part of why we have an Electoral College. And as I suggested before, another nice thing about the Electoral College, it gives more of an appearance of unity than the popular vote would show in most cases. Now, there are some exceptions, but usually, if a candidate wins the popular vote by 4%, he'll win the Electoral College vote by 50% or something. So it looks like we're unified, and that's nice. Yes, let's get behind the new president, instead of, oh, we only won by 0.5%, growl. Okay. What concerns do we have about the Electoral College? Well, several. One of the big concerns is that the most populous states are underrepresented in the Electoral College. because, as I said, all states get the 2 votes for their senators and 1 for each representative. So if you run the numbers, Wyoming has 193,000 residents per elector, while California has more than 700,000 residents per elector. So, you know, Wyoming gets almost 4 times as much bang for their buck as California does. And if I were from California, I wouldn't like it. If I were from Wyoming, I'd be like, yes, yes, we are the sane people out here. But there's a huge difference there. And as we suggested before, a candidate without a plurality of the popular vote can win in the Electoral College. That annoys people, and I think justly so. Campaigns tend to be fought in a few swing states, which is, I don't know, probably worse than being fought in a few populous states. I'm not sure. We could argue about that. But that's the reality. There are probably 8 or 9 swing states in this election. That's where the candidates are focusing almost all of their ads and spending almost all of their time, because everybody knows California is going to go for Biden. Everybody knows that Indiana is going to go for Trump. The candidates aren't going to come here or go to California much, because we know how those states are going to vote. Ohio, on the other hand, is a swing state, and they get a lot more attention from the candidates. So is it really good to have the election fought really for a few undecided voters in a few states instead of being a national campaign, which perhaps it would be if you had no electoral college? Again, one could argue over that. There's also the problem, potentially, of faithless electors, people who don't vote for the person they are supposed to be voting for. And between 1948 and 1988, there were 7 elections where 1 elector didn't vote for the candidate who carried the state. So it was like 1 in 1948 and 1 in 1988 and you know, 5 in elections in between. But in 2016, there were 7 presidential faithless electors who did not vote for the person they were supposed to. And on the vice president side, there were 6 electors that didn't vote for the vice president they were supposed to. So that is kind of disturbing. I mean, the trend there doesn't seem encouraging. Very, very rare to have faithless electors, none before the mid-1900s. And we had more in 2016 than we had in hundreds of years before. And again, there was quite a bit of pressure on some of the Republican electors to change and vote either for a different Republican, and several of them did. Colin Powell got 3 votes, for example, from Republican electors who were theoretically supposed to vote for Trump, or maybe to switch to a Democrat. And you know, it didn't happen with very many, but if the election was really close in the Electoral College, one could see some potential for wheeling and dealing and blackmailing and all kinds of unpleasant things to try to pick up a few electors for one side or the other. Another kind of interesting and maybe frightening tidbit about the way the Electoral College works, if nobody wins a majority in the Electoral College, what do? The House of Representatives chooses the president, and each state gets 1 vote in that case. That happened in 1824. And it also happened in 1800, but that was before we were even doing a popular vote, so that probably doesn't count. But other than that, there was just the one time where Jackson won the popular vote by 10%, but John Quincy Adams made a few deals, pulled a few strings, probably called up some of his daddy's friends, and okay, they didn't have phones then, but anyway, managed to get the victory. Jackson won the next time around, though, so he got his. But it hasn't happened since then. But again, it's kind of a scary thought to think of the House of Representatives choosing the president, but that's what would happen if nobody got a majority in the Electoral College. Okay, changes, actual and proposed, for dealing with the Electoral College. Well, the most straightforward is amend the Constitution to eliminate the Electoral College. That idea has been proposed in Congress several times in the recent past. Problem is that, well, I don't know whether it's a problem, but the reality is that to get an amendment to the Constitution passed, you have to have 2/3 of the senators and 2/3 of the representatives voting for it. And then it goes to the states, and you have to have 3/4 of the states voting for it. The chances of 3/4 of the states voting for it, I think, very small, because small states don't want to give up the advantage they have in the Electoral College. They don't want to give up power. So I'm not sure it would ever pass. Maybe it will, but I think we're not there now. So we'll see if that changes. Another suggestion, give one electoral vote to the candidate who carries each congressional district, with the 2 senatorial votes in the state going to the candidate who wins the state's popular vote. Nebraska and Maine already do that. Nebraska has 3 representatives, Maine has 2. In the case of Maine, the southern district tends to be Democratic, the northern district tends to be Republican. In Nebraska, the eastern district tends to be Democratic, the 2 western districts tend to be Republican. So whoever carries the state gets the 2 Senate votes, and like if the Republican carries the 2 western Nebraska districts, those 2 votes, but then the 3rd vote that went to a Democrat, that went to the Democratic candidate, would go to the Democratic candidate. So you kind of divide up the votes within the state to reflect that not all of the voting goes to one candidate. Another possibility, divide the state's electors proportionately. 60% of the vote for one candidate, let's say, and 40% for the other, then 60% of your electoral votes go for the one and 40% for the other. So like if you had 10 electoral votes and one candidate got 60%, that candidate would get 6 votes, the other candidate would get the remaining 4. Okay? Which again would reflect the fact that not everybody is voting for the same candidate. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, the fact that it has an acronym, and I don't know how to say NPVIC, but in this case, states promise to award their state's electoral vote to the candidate who wins the national popular vote, regardless of who wins the popular vote in that state. So like in the last election, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, so states that had signed onto this compact would have given their electoral votes to Hillary, no matter whether she won their state or not, because she won the popular vote. The goal there is to avoid the situation where one candidate wins in the Electoral College but loses the popular vote, which we had in the last election. And as of July, 15 states and the District of Columbia had adopted this plan, a total of 196 electoral votes, which is 73% of the votes that would be needed to elect a president. Another 6 states are considering the plan, and those states have 64 electoral votes, which is 22% of the total needed to elect a president. That leaves the plan only 10 electoral votes of 270. The question or the problem is whether the plan is constitutional, and I'm pretty sure that if states try to do this, that there will be severe challenges to it. Now, whether it will win or lose in the courts, I don't know. It probably would end up in the Supreme Court, which has become increasingly politicized in recent years, it seems. So who knows how it would end up. But that's the plan and that's the goal. It's kind of making an end run around the Electoral College, recognizing that you probably can't get an amendment passed to eliminate the Electoral College, but maybe we can eliminate it this way before people notice what's happening. So that's a plan that's out there. Indiana, not surprisingly, has not signed on to it. It's mostly the blue states that have signed on to the plan. Okay, finally, before we run out of time, how is the current election shaping up? Well, there's COVID. It's a little hard to say exactly what the effects are going to be here. Obviously, Trump and his wife and his campaign manager and a number of his advisors and the Republican National chairperson all have COVID. 3 Republican senators have COVID. I don't know. It sounds like the whole White House and all of Washington, D.C. has COVID. How is that going to affect? I don't know. It's hard to say what that will do. But another thing that COVID might do, more people are voting by mail than ever before. 36 states allow any voter to request a mail ballot for any reason. I mean, they don't have to offer a reason. They just have to say, I want a mail ballot, and they get it. 9 states in the District of Columbia automatically mail ballots to all registered voters. And 5 states, including Indiana, require some kind of acceptable excuse, like I'm old or I'm sick, to vote by mail. So how will that turn out? I don't know. I mean, there's concern about, will all the ballots get in? Will they get counted, et cetera? Also, there's uncertainty about the turnout in person on November 3rd. Some people may be scared to turn out in person for fear they'll get COVID. I don't know how that will work. Democrats seem to be more likely to be voting by mail than Republicans. So if the Democrats turn their ballots in, that's good for them. If the Republicans don't show up at the polls on election day, that's bad for them. On the other hand, votes by mail are more likely to get thrown out. And yeah, so that might work against the Democrats because there are a lot of things you can do wrong if you don't sign it just right, if you don't have it in by the right time, et cetera. Election outcomes, I did not bother to take a note there, but I will just say we don't know when we're going to know the outcome of the election. Indiana, just within the last few days, got a court decision saying that we have to continue accepting mailed-in ballots up to 10 days after the election, as long as they're postmarked by the date of the election, which doesn't seem unreasonable, but if the election is close, waiting 10 days to be sure you've got all those ballots in and counted could cause people to be a little tense and nervous, and especially in a close election. So we really don't know, but it's possible if it is a really close election that we may not know the outcome for several days and maybe even a week or two after the election. So hold your breath. And finally, little drum roll here. Who do we think is going to win? Well, I picked this partly because it's easy to see. The projections are that Democrats will hold on to the House of Representatives, which is something that they already have. I don't know if I can get rid of that, yes. And probably increase their margin a little bit. Right now, Democrats hold 232 seats and Republicans hold 198. So the projection here is that Republicans are going to have to scramble a little to catch up to Democrats. Democrats will certainly hold the House, probably widen their margin. And the Senate races, let's just see here. The Republicans have a 3-vote majority in the Senate right now. It looks here as though it's just a dead even toss-up. 49 Republicans, pretty sure or leaning, 49 Democrats, pretty sure or leaning, and 2 undecided. So could be a fun election night, but that's the most competitive area, I think. And finally, the Electoral College. You need 270 to win, and their projections are that Biden pretty much has 279 in the bank. Trump has 179. There are 80 undecided toss-up states. Since the debate last Tuesday, several states have tilted more toward the Democrat. You can see here, by the way, Nebraska and Maine are divided because they split their electoral votes. Okay, and let me just go back here real quickly. Biden's pretty heavily favored. And just real quickly, what's different now for Trump maybe than 2016 when he won? Well, people hated Clinton. People don't hate Biden as much. Biden seems like a nice old guy. A lot of people would have voted for the devil rather than Hillary Clinton. She was disliked much more strongly. We don't have as many undecided voters now, so Trump doesn't have as many possibilities to pick from to increase his total. Trump trails in a lot of swing states that he won by a narrow margin in 2016, and overall he trails Biden by 7% or so, which is a lot. Polls say that Biden beat Trump in the debate on Tuesday, which is not good news for Trump because he needed to be picking up some votes. His illness prevents him from campaigning. On the other hand, he's got a few positives. His supporters are much more committed and enthusiastic and passionate than Biden's for the most part, so they're probably more likely to vote. The information about income taxes, et cetera, probably doesn't hurt Trump. People already know it. It was kind of like Bill Clinton, another bimbo eruption, and nobody cares because they knew he's a womanizer, he's a lovable rogue. They voted for him anyway. And I think with Trump's supporters, it's the same thing. It's like, we don't care, you know. And we said before, Democrats are more likely to say they'll vote by mail. Some of those votes will be thrown out. About 1% of the mailed-in ballots were thrown out in the last election, which amounted to 316,000 votes. But in the primary elections this year, over 500,000 ballots were thrown out. So we have more people who've never voted by mail before, and I guess the concern is they may not do the procedure just right, and therefore their ballots may be thrown out. And if we have a close election, I could see a lot of quibbling over that. Well, it got in a day late, but it's a vote. Well, but it's a day late, you know. Is it for our side or your side? And then it becomes really ugly. Some of you can remember the Bush-Gore issue in 2000 and in Florida, the dimpled chads, pregnant chads, hanging chads. Yes. So hopefully it won't be quite that bad. And again, maybe some people will vote for Trump out of sympathy over his illness, or maybe he'll come out of his illness and seem like a more pleasant version of himself, and people will vote for him because of that. But conclusion, I just hope for a clear win in the presidential election. Whoever wins, I hope they win the popular vote, and I hope they take the Electoral College vote in a landslide, because I think we need more unity. I think we're too divided. So, thanks. Questions?
I did receive one question
Oh, dear.
From an alum. She said, what about the silent majority?
Well, are they going to vote? That's the question. I think Trump's support is deeper than the polls indicate, and that may be what the person is getting at. I think there are some people who will vote for Trump, but they will never tell a pollster that they'll vote for Trump because there's some stigma attached. So yeah, I think his vote will be higher than the polls indicate, but the polls indicate that he's down a lot. So in the case of his opposing Hillary, you know, he was down at this point maybe 4% or so, and that's not so impossible to overcome. But when you're down 7 or 8%, that's a lot. It's not impossible, though, you know? So we'll see.
Not a question, but I did have another alum mention that her husband was the director of elections for the state of Ohio for 8 years. It's so important to have people of integrity involved in elections administration, especially in key swing states like Ohio, which you had already mentioned. So.
Amen. And yeah, one of the things that sometimes annoys me is that Christians will sometimes say, I don't want to vote, or I don't want to be involved in politics, I don't want to run from office. It's such a dirty, dishonest business. Well, part of the reason it's a dirty, dishonest business is that we don't have enough people of honesty and integrity, like that alum's husband, who are willing to get involved in politics. So who do you leave it to? Maybe some people, not all, but some who aren't the best, you know?
Any questions from those in the room? Great. You learned a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Do people understand the Electoral College any better, or was that still confusing?
I hope so. No one has any questions, so they must.
The one thing you talked about, the one acronym you couldn't say.
Yeah.
I read 5 articles about that this summer, and I didn't understand, and you made that make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It will be interesting to see whether that actually takes effect and whether people try to enforce that compact. I'm not sure. You know, I think the farmer, my husband, knows a lot about politics, and I was mentioning this to him, and he's like, "What are you talking about? I've never heard of this." And I don't know. Had any of you had heard of it before, right? Has anybody else in the audience heard of that?
In my mind, I was excited that it would, without knowing a lot, that the electoral would vote with the popular.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a lot to be said for that. But on the other hand, the Electoral College is part of the Constitution, and it's sort of troubling to me to think of, you know, you can't get the amendment through the Constitution, so you figure out another way to get what you want instead of doing it through the proper procedure. And it seems like if there's all that much support for making the change, then we probably should run it through the amendment process. Although, I don't know, it's hard to get states to vote against their own self-interest.
Dr. Ruthi, I got a very important question. Do you still make chocolate chip cookies for students?
Well, I do, but not this year because I'm afraid of them being exposed to germs. It's sad. And I also used to encourage people to pick up M&Ms out of my office, and I'm trying to discourage that now because I couldn't think of any way to make it really sanitary. I mean, I don't really want to spray the M&Ms with hand sanitizer or something. So yeah, those traditions suffer.
Yes, absolutely.
Hopefully we'll be rid of COVID soon.
Let me share with you just a couple of comments. Luke Fetter says, thanks for your years of stellar service. Look at you smoothly adapting to virtual delivery.
Not as smoothly as he thinks.
I have to have a mother and daughter on together, and one says, thank you, Dr. Ruthi, for your speech tonight. Thank you for sharing. And someone else said, thank you, I enjoyed your class at Huntington. Your talk today was great.
That's really
Thank you
nice.
for your years at HU, etc. So
I paid them to
alums
say
are
that.
happy to be here with you today.
Well, I'm happy to be here with them.
Okay,
We're good?
I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you guys.
Yes.
Go vote.